Your muscle cells have two doors for glucose. One opens with insulin, the hormone your pancreas releases after a meal, the signal your doctor tests with fasting glucose and HbA1c panels, the pathway that metformin targets, the mechanism the entire diabetes conversation revolves around. Every blood test, every dietary recommendation, every medication adjustment your doctor's made has been about this one door. How well it opens, how quickly it responds, how much glucose it clears from the blood before the damage accumulates. The second door opens with contraction. Skeletal muscle contracting against resistance, muscle fibers shortening and lengthening under load. The physical act of movement activating a molecular pathway that pulls glucose from the blood into the muscle cell without requiring insulin at all. The second door has been there your entire life. It is present in every skeletal muscle cell in your body. It functions regardless of how well the insulin door is working. Your doctor has almost certainly never mentioned it, not because the science is new, but because the medical conversation about glucose has been so thoroughly focused on insulin that the contraction pathway has been treated as exercise physiology rather than metabolic medicine. And a 10-minute walk after eating opens it. In 2022, Reynolds and colleagues published in Sports Medicine a meta-analysis of 7 studies examining one variable, what happens to blood glucose when you walk after a meal versus when you sit. The studies varied in population. Some tested healthy adults, some tested people with type 2 diabetes, some tested people with impaired glucose tolerance. They varied in meal type. Some used standardized glucose loads, some used mixed meals, some used the participants' habitual meals. They varied in walking duration and intensity. The finding was consistent across every study, every population, every meal type tested. Walking within 60 to 90 minutes of eating reduced the postprandial glucose peak, reductions ranging from 20 to 40% depending on the study, the meal, and the population. The consistency across such varied conditions is what makes the finding robust. It is not an effect that depends on the specific meal, the specific population, or the specific walking protocol. It is a physiological response to contraction after eating that operates across all conditions tested. The mechanism is not caloric. 10 minutes of walking burns roughly 30 to 40 calories, a negligible fraction of any meal's energy content. The mechanism is molecular. Skeletal muscle contraction activates a glucose transporter called glucose from the blood into the muscle cell through a pathway that operates independently of insulin. The walk does not burn the sugar. It opens a door that lets the sugar leave the blood. GLUT4, glucose transporter type 4, is the molecule that makes this work. Understanding what it does and how it responds to 2 independent signals is the physics beneath every claim in this discussion, and it is physics the dietary conversation has entirely omitted. Glucose cannot cross cell membranes by itself. The molecule is too large and too polar to pass through the lipid bilayer that surrounds every cell. The membrane is a barrier designed to keep the cell's internal chemistry separate from the external environment, and glucose, with its 6 carbon atoms and multiple hydroxyl groups, cannot slip through. It requires a transporter protein, a molecular channel embedded in the cell membrane that binds glucose on the outside, changes shape, and releases it on the inside. In skeletal muscle, that transporter is GLUT4. But GLUT4 is not permanently stationed at the cell surface waiting for glucose to arrive. It is stored inside the cell, sequestered in vesicles in the cytoplasm, held in reserve, waiting for a signal to move to the membrane. Without the signal, the transporter stays inside. The glucose stays outside. The door is closed. The blood glucose stays elevated because the muscle, which accounts for approximately 80% of insulin-mediated glucose disposal, is not absorbing it. 2 signals cause these vesicles to fuse with the cell membrane, inserting GLUT4 into the surface and opening the door. The first signal is insulin. Insulin binds to its receptor on the muscle cell surface, initiating an intracellular cascade. PI3K activates ACT. ACT signals the GLUT4 vesicles to move to the membrane. This is the pathway the medical system monitors, tests, and medicates. When your doctor measures fasting glucose, they are checking the overnight baseline that reflects how well the insulin pathway cleared glucose from the last meal. When they measure HbA1c, they are measuring the cumulative glycation on hemoglobin molecules over the preceding 3 months, a time-averaged index of how much glucose has been in the blood and for how long. When they prescribe metformin or adjust sulfonylurea dosing, they are trying to improve how well this pathway functions. The entire glucose management conversation in clinical medicine is centered on this one cascade: insulin binding, PI3K activating, ACT signaling, GLUT4 moving to the membrane. Second signal is muscle contraction. When skeletal muscle contracts, when the fibers shorten under neural command, when the myosin heads pull on the actin filaments, when the muscle does mechanical work, a different intracellular cascade activates. AMPK and calcium-dependent kinases detect the energy expenditure and the calcium flux of contraction, and they signal the GLUT4 vesicles to move to the membrane through a pathway that does not involve insulin at all. No insulin required, no insulin receptor activation, no PI3K, no ACT. A completely independent molecular route to an identical outcome. GLUT4 at the cell surface, glucose entering the muscle cell. Think about what that means. Two pathways are independent. Either signal alone opens the door. Both signals together open more doors, more GLUT4 vesicles fuse with the membrane, more transporters are inserted, more glucose channels are available. When you walk after eating, both pathways are active simultaneously. Insulin is elevated from the meal, and muscle contraction is providing the second signal. The result? More GLUT4 at the cell surface than either signal would produce alone. More glucose leaving the blood. A lower glucose peak. A faster return to baseline. The independence is the critical insight, because it means the contraction pathway compensates for failures in the insulin pathway. The person whose insulin sensitivity has declined with age, whose beta cells produce insulin, the tissues respond to with diminishing efficiency, whose fasting glucose has been drifting upward despite dietary modifications. That person's contraction pathway is intact. It does not degrade with insulin resistance. It does not require the pancreas to produce more insulin. It does not require the tissues to become more sensitive to the insulin that is already there. It requires the muscle to contract. The walk provides the contraction. The contraction opens the door. Insulin is struggling to open. The two pathways are not redundant. They are complementary, and the complementarity becomes more valuable as insulin sensitivity declines, which means the post-meal walk becomes more beneficial, not less, as the person ages. That independence, the contraction pathway functioning at full capacity, regardless of how degraded the insulin pathway has become, is the finding that made every post-meal chair look like a closed door to me. Now, what happens to the glucose curve when that second door opens? Because the shape of the curve after a meal determines how much damage the glucose does while it is elevated. After a meal, blood glucose rises as carbohydrates are digested in the stomach and small intestine and absorbed through the intestinal wall into the portal circulation. In a healthy response, insulin is secreted by the pancreas within minutes, GLUT4 is translocated to muscle cell surfaces, glucose is cleared from the blood, and levels return to baseline within 2 to 3 hours. The shape of this response, how high the peak rises, how long the elevation lasts, and how quickly it returns to baseline, is the postprandial glucose curve. Every person produces one after every meal. The shape varies with the food, with the person's insulin sensitivity, with the time of day the chrononutrition discussion described, and with whether the person walks or sits after eating. Curve matters because every minute of elevated glucose is a minute during which glucose molecules are reacting with proteins in the blood vessel walls. The reaction is non-enzymatic. It does not require an enzyme to catalyze it. Glucose binds spontaneously to the amino groups of proteins through a process called glycation, producing molecular crosslinks that accumulate as advanced glycation end products, AGEs. The reaction rate is proportional to glucose concentration and exposure time. Higher glucose for longer produces more AGEs. Lower glucose for shorter produces fewer. The relationship is direct and cumulative. Each meal's postprandial curve adds its glycation contribution to the lifetime total. AGEs accumulate in arterial walls, making them stiffer and less compliant. They accumulate in collagen throughout the body, making joints rigid, tendons brittle, skin less elastic. They accumulate in the lens of the eye, contributing to the opacity that becomes cataract. The entropy discussion described glycation as one of the molecular mechanisms through which the second law wins. Glucose binding to proteins, ordered structures becoming permanently disordered through a reaction that cannot be reversed. Every unit of area under the postprandial glucose curve represents cumulative glycation exposure, time multiplied by concentration, the total glucose burden, the vasculature absorbs after each meal. Flattening the curve reduces this exposure, not by changing the food, by opening an additional glucose clearance pathway through contraction. Walking after eating flattens this curve. The peak is lower, the return to baseline is faster, the total area under the curve is reduced. Reduction is not trivial. Reynolds' meta-analysis documented peak glucose reductions of 20 to 40% from walking versus sitting after identical meals. The range varying with the population and the meal composition, the direction consistent across every study. Substantially less peak exposure, substantially less time at the elevated concentration that drives glycation, from identical food. The food did not change. The glucose clearance pathway changed. The contraction door opened alongside the insulin door, and the combined clearance rate exceeded what insulin alone could achieve. You see, and the timing of the walk matters, because GLUT4 translocation from contraction is not instantaneous and it does not persist indefinitely. There is a window during which the contraction signal and the arriving glucose overlap, and walking during that window produces the maximum effect. Postprandial glucose peak occurs approximately 30 to 60 minutes after eating in most individuals. The time required for gastric emptying, enzymatic digestion in the duodenum, and absorption through the intestinal wall into the bloodstream. Walking during the ascending phase of the glucose curve, before the peak, is most effective at blunting the peak because GLUT4 is inserting into muscle membranes at the time glucose is entering the blood. The two rates overlap. Glucose arrival from the gut meets glucose clearance through the contraction-activated transporters. The overlap is what flattens the curve. Kohlberg and colleagues published in Diabetes Care in 2009 that walking beginning 15 to 20 minutes after the start of a meal produced the greatest postprandial glucose reduction. Walking before eating produced a smaller effect. The GLUT4 translocation had partially reversed by the time glucose arrived from the meal, the transporters retreating from the membrane back into their vesicles as the contraction signal faded. Walking 90 minutes after eating produced a smaller effect. The glucose peak had already occurred, the glycation window had already opened, and the walk was clearing glucose that had already spent its most damaging minutes in contact with the vessel walls. The optimal window is 10 to 30 minutes after finishing the meal, close enough that contraction-mediated GLUT4 activation coincides with peak glucose arrival from the gut. The person who finishes lunch and walks immediately is slightly early but still effective. The person who finishes lunch and walks 10 minutes later is in the center of the window. The person who finishes lunch and walks 2 hours later has missed the ascending phase entirely. The benefit is still present but reduced because the peak has already occurred. Well, and the walk does something to the digestive process itself that compounds the glucose effect. Because upright movement after eating changes how the stomach empties, and the rate of stomach emptying determines how quickly glucose arrives in the bloodstream. Walking after eating enhances gastric motility, the rhythmic contractions of the stomach wall that mix food with digestive enzymes and propel the partially digested mixture toward the pyloric sphincter and into the duodenum. The mechanism is both postural and mechanical. Upright posture allows gravity to assist gastric emptying. The pylorus is positioned at the dependent portion of the stomach when the body is vertical, and gravity draws the gastric contents toward it. Sitting, especially reclining after a meal, positions the pylorus horizontally or above the gastric pool, requiring peristaltic force alone to move the stomach contents against gravity. Walking adds a second mechanical advantage. The rhythmic compression of the abdominal wall during each step produces gentle oscillations in intra-abdominal pressure that supplement the intrinsic peristaltic contractions. Each step is a small external massage of the stomach through the abdominal wall. If you have ever felt the difference between sitting after a large meal and walking after an identical meal, the heaviness that persists when you sit versus the gradual lightening that arises when you move, you have felt the gastric motility difference. The heaviness is the stomach retaining its contents because peristalsis alone is insufficient to empty it efficiently against unfavorable posture. The lightening is gravitational assistance, plus mechanical compression accelerating the emptying rate. Franke and colleagues published in the Scandinavian Journal of Gastroenterology that walking after a meal significantly accelerated gastric emptying compared to sitting. Faster gastric emptying distributes the nutrient load more evenly across the absorptive surface of the small intestine. The glucose enters the bloodstream at a more moderate, sustained rate rather than arriving in a concentrated bolus that spikes the curve. The walk does not just clear glucose from the blood through gluteal-UT4. It also moderates the rate at which glucose enters the blood through improved gastric distribution. The curve flattens from both sides. Slower arrival from the gut and faster clearance through the muscle, both effects from one action, both operating simultaneously during the 10-minute walk. And then, the cardiovascular dimension. Because the post-meal walk produces a mild cardiovascular stimulus at the exact moment the cardiovascular system is already working harder, and it resolves a problem the chrononutrition discussion identified but did not address from this angle. After eating, blood flow redistributes toward the mesenteric vasculature, the arteries supplying the stomach, small intestine, and liver to support digestion and nutrient absorption. This redistribution is parasympathetic. The vagus nerve increases blood flow to the gut as part of the rest and digest response, diverting it from skeletal muscle, from the brain, and from the periphery. This is the heaviness you feel after a large meal. Blood diverted from the muscles and the brain toward the gut, producing the drowsiness and physical lethargy that makes the post-meal period feel like the body is shutting down. The chrononutrition discussion identified this as one reason. Evening meals impair sleep onset. The parasympathetic digestive shift compounds with the circadian parasympathetic shift, producing a drowsiness that arrives hours before the body's natural sleep window. During a post-meal walk, skeletal muscle demands increased blood flow for contraction, at the time the digestive tract is demanding increased blood flow for absorption. The cardiovascular system must supply both demands simultaneously. The gut needs blood for absorption, the muscles need blood for contraction, and the total demand exceeds what resting cardiac output provides. Result is a modest increase in cardiac output. Heart rate increases slightly, stroke volume increases, and total blood flow rises to accommodate both the digestive and the muscular demand. This mild cardiovascular challenge is a beneficial stimulus, a gentle post-meal cardiac workout at an intensity well below exercise threshold, well below the level that would divert blood from the digestive tract and impair absorption. The heart works slightly harder. The vasculature dilates in two vascular beds at once, mesenteric and muscular. The cardiac output rises by a margin that is safe, beneficial, and achieved without deliberate exercise. And here is what the person who walks after eating feels. Drowsiness resolves. The blood redistribution that produced the heaviness is partially reversed. The muscles now have a legitimate claim on blood flow, and the cardiovascular system responds by increasing total output rather than robbing the gut. The person who walks after eating feels more alert, more energetic, more mentally clear than the person who sits. Not because the walk is stimulating in the conventional sense, but because the walk resolved the blood flow redistribution that was producing the drowsiness. The alertness is the brain receiving adequate blood flow again because the heart increased its output to serve both the gut and the muscles, rather than prioritizing the gut at the brain's expense. Consider the dose. Because the amount of walking required is far smaller than most people assume, and the benefit saturates earlier than the exercise literature would predict. The person who hears walk after eating may picture a 30-minute brisk walk and dismiss it as impractical after a meal. The data says otherwise. Buffy and colleagues published in Sports Medicine in 2022 a systematic review comparing light walking versus standing versus sitting after meals. Walking produced the largest reduction in postprandial glucose. Standing produced a smaller but significant reduction. Simply being upright without walking improved glucose clearance compared to sitting, likely through the tonic muscle contraction required to maintain upright posture, activating a low level of GLUT4 translocation. Sitting produced no benefit. The hierarchy is clear: walking is best, standing is second, sitting is worst. Dose required was minimal. 2 to 5 minutes of walking produced measurable glucose reductions. GLUT4 translocation begins with the first contraction and builds with each subsequent step. 10 to 15 minutes produced near maximal effects. The transporter insertion approaches a steady state beyond which additional walking does not insert substantially more GLUT4 into the membrane. The effect saturates. Extending the walk beyond 15 minutes did not significantly increase the glucose reduction. The additional walking burns more calories but does not open more doors. Saturation is important for the person over 65 because it means the prescription is precise and achievable. 10 minutes of walking after the largest meal produces approximately 90% of the achievable glucose reduction. 10 minutes at any pace that involves skeletal muscle contraction. And all walking involves skeletal muscle contraction. A stroll through the house counts. A slow walk around the block counts. A circuit of the garden counts. Walking with a cane counts. Walking with a walker counts. The GLUT4 pathway does not distinguish between vigorous walking and gentle walking. It responds to contraction, and contraction occurs at any speed the person can manage. The doors do not open wider with more effort. They open with any effort. Now, the Metformin Parallel. Because the most widely prescribed diabetes medication in the world targets the molecular pathway that the post-meal walk activates, and understanding the parallel changes how the walk relates to the prescription. Metformin, which a person taking it should continue exactly as prescribed, works partly through AMPK activation, the energy-sensing kinase that muscle contraction also activates. AMPK detects when cellular energy expenditure increases when the ratio of AMP to ATP rises, indicating that the cell is consuming energy faster than it is producing it, and responds by promoting GLUT4 translocation, increasing glucose uptake, and improving insulin sensitivity. Metformin activates AMPK through a pharmacological mechanism. It inhibits complex 1 of the mitochondrial electron transport chain, creating a mild energy deficit that mimics the effect of physical activity at the molecular level. The drug makes the cell think it is exercising. Walking activates AMPK through a physiological mechanism. The actual energy expenditure of muscle contraction depletes ATP. The AMP to ATP ratio rises naturally, and AMPK activates in response to a genuine metabolic signal rather than a pharmacological mimic. The walk is not a substitute for the prescription. It is identical biology, activated through a different input, contraction instead of chemistry. And the two inputs are additive. A person who takes metformin and walks after eating has AMPK activation from both the drug and the contraction simultaneously, producing more GLUT4 translocation than either alone. The walk complements the prescription through the pathway the prescription was designed to target. The person who takes metformin and sits after eating is using 1 AMPK input. The person who takes metformin and walks after eating is using 2. The second input costs nothing and takes 10 minutes. That convergence, GLUT4 contraction-mediated translocation clearing glucose from the blood, independently of insulin, gastric motility improvement, moderating the rate of glucose arrival, cardiovascular dual demand stimulus, resolving post-meal drowsiness while providing a gentle cardiac workout, an AMPK activation paralleling the mechanism of the most prescribed diabetes drug, is the finding that made the postprandial walk look like the most undertreated intervention in metabolic medicine to me. 4 mechanisms, 10 minutes, after eating, no equipment, no prescription, no cost. And a reduction in the glucose peak that drives the vascular damage the medical system spends billions treating downstream. The AGEs accumulating in arterial walls, the collagen crosslinks stiffening joints, the lens opacities clouding vision, all produced by glucose that stayed in the blood longer than it needed to because the contraction door was closed while the person sat after every meal for decades. Finish eating. Begin walking within the next 5 to 15 minutes. The Kohlberg data measured optimal timing from the start of the meal, not the end, so a meal that took 20 minutes to eat plus 10 minutes of waiting puts the walk 30 minutes after the first bite. The effective window is broad. Any time between finishing the meal and 45 minutes after the first bite captures the ascending phase of the glucose curve. The precise minute matters less than the principle. Walk while glucose is still rising, not after it has peaked. Walk for 10 minutes at a comfortable pace. Any pace. The contraction is what matters, not the speed. The gut-4 vesicles do not respond to velocity. They respond to the calcium flux and the AMPK activation that contraction produces, and those signals occur at every walking speed from a slow shuffle to a brisk stride. The person who can only walk slowly receives the contraction signal. The person who walks vigorously receives the contraction signal. The gut-4 response does not discriminate by fitness level. It responds to movement. Do this after your largest meal of the day. The largest meal produces the highest glucose peak, the peak that produces the most glycation, the peak that benefits most from the contraction-mediated clearance. If the largest meal is lunch, if the chrononutrition discussion's circadian alignment has moved the heaviest eating to midday when insulin sensitivity is highest, the post-meal walk combines circadian insulin sensitivity with contraction. Mediated glucose clearance. Both pathways active. Both timing windows aligned. The postprandial curve flattens from every direction. Better insulin response from circadian timing, better glucose clearance from walking, better gastric distribution from upright movement. If you cannot walk, if mobility limitations, joint pain, or balance concerns prevent a 10-minute walk after eating, standing produces a measurable benefit over sitting. Buffy's data showed standing reduced postprandial glucose by approximately 10% compared to sitting, 1/3 of the walking benefit, but meaningful nonetheless. Standing activates the tonic contraction of postural muscles, the continuous low-level muscle activity required to maintain upright posture against gravity, the calves contracting, the quadriceps engaging, the trunk musculature stabilizing. That tonic contraction activates GLUT4 translocation at a lower level than walking, but at a higher level than sitting. If you can stand at a counter for 10 minutes after eating, rather than sitting in a chair, the contraction signal is present. The door opens partway. Partway open is better than closed, and partway open while standing can be combined with gentle weight shifts, small steps, or even marching in place. Any contraction that adds to the tonic baseline and moves the GLUT4 response closer to the walking level. And if you can walk but have been told to rest after eating, if the culture of instruction was to sit after a meal, to let the food settle, to avoid activity during digestion, to lie down after a heavy lunch, the physiology contradicts the instruction. Walking at a gentle pace does not impair digestion. It enhances it. The gastric motility data from Frank confirms that upright walking improves gastric emptying rather than disrupting it. The food does not need to settle. The food needs to be distributed efficiently across the absorptive surface of the small intestine. And walking achieves that distribution through gravitational assistance and mechanical compression. The instruction to rest after eating was cultural, not physiological. The physiology says, move. Now, the summary of the physics. Your muscle cells have 2 doors for glucose. One opens with insulin, the door your doctor has been managing for years, testing it with fasting glucose and HbA1c, medicating it with metformin or sulfonylureas, monitoring it with quarterly blood panels, worrying about it when the numbers drift upward. The contraction door has been there the entire time, present in every muscle cell, functional at every age, responsive to contraction at every fitness level, independent of insulin sensitivity, independent of beta cell function, independent of the pharmaceutical interventions the medical system applies to the first door. It does not require a prescription. It does not require a blood test. It does not require insurance approval. It requires a walk. 10 minutes after eating. The glucose curve flattens. The glycation exposure drops. The vascular damage that would have accumulated during 2 hours of elevated postprandial glucose is reduced by the percentage of glucose that left the blood through the contraction door instead of waiting for the insulin door to clear it. The contraction door was always there. It opens with the first step. It stays open for the duration of the walk, each step maintaining the GLUT4 translocation, each contraction sustaining the AMPK signal, each minute of walking extending the window during which glucose leaves the blood through a pathway insulin alone could not provide, and the glucose that passes through it. The glucose the muscle absorbed, because the GLUT4 vesicles fused with the membrane in response to contraction, never reaches the vessel walls. It would have damaged if you had sat down instead.